Privilege and honor to introduce somebody that does not need an introduction, Dr. Dean Ornish, truly a pioneer for all of us in lifestyle medicine. And you know, the saying is often, I often say that, you know, we stand on the shoulders of people that provided an amazing foundation for us, and Dean Ornish is truly one of those people. I believe in creating honor and honoring those that have gone before us, and so, you know, I want you all to honor Dean Ornish as you welcome him today. And the other thing I want to do before you clap, as a way of showing honor, Dr. Dean Ornish recently published a book called Undo It. This week, we're trying to help Dean's book get pushed up on the New York Times bestseller list. So my request to you is that if you would take some time at lunchtime to buy a copy, and then on your social media platforms, send out that request to your friends and all of your contacts to purchase the book so we can help Dean push his book up and gain the notoriety and publicity that it really deserves. So if we would do that, I want to welcome to the stage right now Dr. Dean Ornish. Thank you, man.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to again salute Scott for his incredible, not only pioneering vision, but his ability to create events like this. I want to talk to you today about the power of lifestyle medicine. And as you probably know, lifestyle medicine is using lifestyle changes not only to help prevent disease, but to treat and often even reverse it. And I think it's the most exciting trend in medicine today. And after so many years, I think our time has finally come. The program has four main components: a whole foods plant-based diet that's low in fat and sugar, various stress management techniques including meditation and yoga, moderate exercise, and what we call psychosocial support, which is really love and intimacy, or to reduce it even further, to eat well, move more, stress less, and love more. Boom, that's it. And the more diseases we study and the more underlying mechanisms we look at, the more scientific evidence we have to show how powerful these changes can be and how quickly people can get better. And in this new book that Scott mentioned, I put forth what I call a unifying theory, and that is that I was trained, like most doctors, to view heart disease and diabetes and prostate cancer and Alzheimer's disease as being fundamentally different. But we found that these same lifestyle changes, it wasn't there was one set of lifestyle changes for reversing heart disease, another one for reversing diabetes or high blood pressure or high cholesterol or even early stage prostate cancer. Was the same for all of them. The reason why I think that these same lifestyle changes can affect so many different diseases is that they're really the same disease masquerading and manifesting in different forms. And you know, I was trained, like all doctors, to say these are all very different diseases, different diagnoses, different treatments. And yet with all this talk about personalized medicine, which by the way is great if you're talking about developing a targeted immunotherapy for, say, melanoma, but for the vast majority of chronic diseases that we've been talking about, it was the same diet and lifestyle program that we found in 40 years of research that could reverse all of them. And the reason is that I think that they're really the same disease, is that they all share the same underlying biological mechanisms. Things like chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in telomeres and gene expression and the microbiome and angiogenesis and so on. And every one of these mechanisms, in turn, is directly influenced by what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and how much love and support we have. And so that makes it radically simple. So my new book that I co-wrote with my wife and partner of over 20 years, Anne, puts forth this unifying theory in a way that makes it radically simple. Eat well, move more, stress less, love more. That's it. And it begins with a quote from Albert Einstein, which is one of my favorite quotes, that says, if you can't make it simple, you don't understand it well enough. So we tried to reduce it down to its essence. And I think that, you know, that makes it easier to teach it for people as well. Just say, look, just cut through all the conflicting clutter and noise and smoke and so on to say it's really radically simple. And the guiding principle for all of my work for the last 4 decades has been this very simple question. And it's a radical question as well, because radical means to get to the root of something, the cause. And I've been showing this cartoon, I had it drawn 40 years ago, of, you know, we spend so much time in medicine mopping up the floor without also turning off the faucet. So when people get put on drugs to lower their cholesterol, their blood pressure, their blood sugar, and they say, doctor, how long do I have to take these drugs? What does the doctor usually say? Forever, exactly. It's like, how long do I have to mop up the floor? Like, forever. Well, why don't we just turn off the faucet? And what I'm continually impressed by is that these biological mechanisms are so dynamic that our bodies often have a remarkable capacity to begin healing. and much more quickly than we had once realized when we can just turn off the faucet or treat the cause. Our diet's been rated #1 for heart health by a panel of experts at US News and World Report just about every year since they started rating diets in 2011, which is a nice justification. But after so many years of doing this, I think our time has finally come. It's the right idea at the right time. And all the things that we are going to talk about this morning were thought impossible. And that's, to me, part of the value of doing science, is that it can redefine what's possible, and by doing so can give, at this point, literally millions of people new hope and new choices. So I started doing this work back, in 1977, 78, when I was a second-year medical student. And I was learning how to do bypass surgery with Michael DeBakey, one of the pioneering heart surgeons who basically invented the procedure. And it was fun at first. We cut people open, we bypassed their clogged arteries, he'd tell them they were cured. But more often than not, they would go home and do all the things that had caused the problem in the first place. Eat junk food, not manage stress, not exercise, not have much social support. And often the bypasses would clog up, they'd come back, we'd cut them open again, sometimes multiple times. And so for me, bypass surgery became a metaphor of an incomplete approach. We were literally bypassing the problem, we weren't treating the cause. And so I wondered what would happen if we turned off the faucet. And I went to these things most of you don't know about because you're not old enough, called libraries, and they have these things called books and journals, and and you copying machines for 10 cents that people would often have the pages ripped out of. Anyway, I learned that I kind of got obsessed with this, that in dogs and cats and pigs and rabbits and monkeys, you could cause them to get heart disease if you put them on a high-fat, high-animal protein diet, if you stressed them, if you disrupted their social networks, if you didn't let them exercise. But you could reverse it if you changed those. I said, why should people be any different? And people say, oh no, it can't be done. So one of the nice things about being a medical student is you'll try things you wouldn't do if you knew better. So I put 10 men and women in a hotel for a month, and we used what was then a new test called thallium that measured blood flow to the heart. And we found the blood flow improved in 8 of the 10 patients, and most of them became pain-free. This is a representative patient here. The thing there is the heart, and the brighter it is, the more blood it's getting. So around 10 o'clock on the left side is the before picture. And you can see that dark area around 10 o'clock, which just 30 days later was essentially normal. And again, most of the patients show that. It was also my first experience that when you're doing something that's really disruptive, it's not really met with universal acceptance. It was like, well, that can't be done. The machine must be wrong, or it gets held to a different standard. Or you didn't have a randomized control group. How do you know they wouldn't have gotten better anyway? I say, well, that's technically true, but how often have you seen patients get better anyway? Well, that's beside the point, So I went back to school, finished medical school, then did a second study. This time we did have a randomized control group for comparison. And we found the experimental group got better, shown in yellow. The control group got worse. The differences were highly significant. We published that in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And most of the patients became pain-free during that time, which is a very powerful motivator. We'll talk more about that. Went to Boston to do my medical residency, moved to San Francisco, began the most definitive study called the Lifestyle Heart Trial. And this used quantitative arteriography to measure the blockages in the arteries and cardiac PET scans to measure blood flow to the heart. And we also looked at cardiac events as well. And these were all blindly assessed by independent observers who are, if anything, a little hostile to the whole idea, which is the best kind of people to work with, because then if you find something, then they believe it. And I remember one of the guys who was doing the PET scans, who's from Alabama, called me up. He said, Dean, I used to think you were full of shit. I'm not so sure anymore. And when he began to see in his own lab these patients getting better. And you can see here, all these patients had at least one artery that was 75% stenosed at the beginning. But they were comparable at the beginning, and they showed in the red line was the randomized control group, who were doing what most doctors recommended, eat less red meat, more fish and chicken, take the skin off the chicken, 4 eggs a week and all that. They got worse after 1 year, and their arteries got even more clogged after 5 years. But the people who made these intensive lifestyle changes showed some reversal after 1 year in the green line, and even more reversal after 5 years. And these differences, we published the 1-year findings in the Lancet and the 5-year findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And you couldn't even do the study today because none of the patients in the experimental group was taking cholesterol-lowering drugs during the 5 years of the study. So we could look at the effects of lifestyle changes alone without being confounded with the usual drugs and so on that people are taking now. Half of the control group patients were taking cholesterol-lowering drugs. Those drugs did slow the rate of progression, but they didn't go far enough to stop or reverse it. And yet, even without the drugs, we were able to show reversal in the group that made these changes. And statins are not without side effects. One of the side effects of statins is diabetes, and the most common complication of diabetes is heart disease. We found a 40% average reduction in LDL cholesterol. This is comparable to what you can get with drugs, but without the costs and without the side effects, except the only side effects are good ones. We also found a 400% improvement in blood flow to the heart as measured by cardiac PET scans compared to the randomized control group. And this is, again, a representative patient. At the upper left at the beginning, you can see the narrowing in one of the arteries that feeds the heart, where the arrow is. A year later, it's less clogged. And because of the blood flow to the heart, or perfusion, is a fourth power function of the diameter, even modest changes in blockages cause exponentially improvements in blood flow. And you can see here on the left, the lower left at beginning, blue and black with the PET scan is no blood flow. And the lower right, a year later, it's mostly white and orange, which is maximal blood flow. And this isn't best case, this is truly representative. And I can say that because 99% of the patients were able to stop or reverse the progression of their disease who made these lifestyle changes, where only 5% of the control group patients got better. And one of the interesting findings that surprised me, I had thought incorrectly, as it turned out, that the younger patients who had milder disease would show more improvement, but I was wrong. It wasn't how old they were, it wasn't how sick they were. The more they changed, the more they improved at any age, which I think is a very empowering and hopeful message to give your patients. And we found 2.5 times as many cardiac events, heart attacks, strokes, bypasses, angioplasties, stents, and so on, in the control group as in the experimental group. Since then, we've been training hospitals and clinics around the country. Medicare is covering our program, most insurance companies are. That's another story which I'll get to later. But to show, I think the biggest obstacle that we have as physicians or health educators is this idea that lifestyle changes, how powerful could that be? It's got to be a new drug, a new laser, a new procedure, a new device, something really high-tech and expensive to be powerful. And I think our unique contribution has been to use these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove how powerful these very simple and low-tech and low-cost interventions can be. And to show how powerful they can be, we have probably over a dozen patients now whose heart disease was so bad they were told that the only thing that could save their life would be to have a heart transplant. It's pretty radical. And one of them went through our program at UCLA, who's a doctor himself, to get in better shape for the surgery 9 weeks later while they were looking for a heart donor. And his heart function improved so much in the 9 weeks of going through our program, he didn't need a heart transplant anymore. So what's the more radical intervention here? A heart transplant or eat well, move more, stress less, love more? This is a PET scan of another patient who avoided a heart transplant where we actually not only did a PET to look at blood flow to the heart, but also used a radiolabeled sugar molecule called FDG. And the cells of the heart take up sugar as their fuel, so you can see how many of them are working. And you see how much more red there was 9 weeks later on the right than on the left? What that means is that a lot of the heart muscle that they thought was dead or scarred or infarcted was in fact stunned or hibernating, woke up and began to function again. And that's why his heart began beating so much better he didn't need a heart transplant anymore. We then found that these same lifestyle changes could reverse early-stage prostate cancer. We did this study in collaboration with the chair of urology at UCSF, Dr. Peter Carroll, and the chair of urology at the time here in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Dr. Bill Fair. And we took men who had biopsy-proven prostate cancer who had chosen not to do surgery or radiation for reasons unrelated to the study, so we could then look at the effects of lifestyle changes alone by having a true non-intervention control group. And what we found is that the PSA levels, which as you know is a marker for prostate cancer, went up or got worse in the control group, went down or got better in the experimental group who made these lifestyle changes. These differences were highly significant. And once again, they occurred in direct proportion to the degree of lifestyle change. The more people changed, the better they got. But other things can affect PSA, so we sent some of their serum to UCLA to a lab where they added it to a standard line of prostate tumor cells growing in tissue culture, and found that the prostate tumor was inhibited 70% in the experimental group versus only 9% in the control group, also in direct proportion to the degree of lifestyle change. The more people changed their lifestyle, the more it kept the tumor from growing. There's something that in the blood that actually inhibited the growth of this, even in tissue culture. And when we measured the activity of the tumor in a subset of these patients, shown in red here, you can see the tumor activity was shrinking or getting better, as well as the PSA coming down. And none of the experimental group patients needed surgery or radiation or chemotherapy, but 6 of the control group patients did during that first year. So we wondered what some of the, and by the way, in the Physicians' Health Study, this was done at Harvard Walter Willard's group, that the men who ate a mostly Western diet had a 250% higher risk of the prostate cancer causing death whereas the people who actually, and a 67% risk of increased death from any cause, whereas those eating a plant-based diet actually were protective. So not only are you not increasing it, it's actually decreasing the risk. And prostate cancer is only a problem when it spreads. And there's something about a meat-based diet that increases the likelihood of the tumor spreading. So we wondered what some of the mechanisms might be to help explain these findings. So we looked at their gene expression, and we found that over 500 genes were changed in just 3 months. You know, when I was in medical school, which wasn't that long ago, we were told that, you know, your genes you're stuck with your genes. The only way you can change your genes is to change your parents, which obviously you can't do. But it turns out that our genes are controlled by switches that are controlled by proteins, histone, non-histone proteins, methylation, and so on. And they basically can turn on a gene or turn it off. So if you can turn off a gene that does bad things like cause cancer or cause chronic inflammation or oxidative stress or all these different mechanisms we've been talking about, you're effectively changing your genes. And we particularly found that the oncogenes that promote prostate, breast, and colon cancer were switched off, you know, just within, again, a few months. This is what's called a heat map. Along the right side are different genes that cause cancer. On the left at the beginning, it's mostly red, which means those genes were turned on. And then just 3 months later on the right, the green means they're mostly turned off. I think that's pretty amazing. That had never been shown in that way before. And we also found that we turned off the genes that cause these other biological mechanisms we've been talking about, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in microbiome, and so on. So our genes are a predisposition, but our genes are not our fate. And I think that's really important because so often people say, oh, I've just got bad genes, what can I do? Well, it turns out you can do a lot. Again, not to blame people, but to empower them. There's a lot we can do to do that. Meditation itself can change gene expression. I think that's important because so often people say, you know, when I'm exercising, I'm really out there, I'm doing something, and you know, you have to eat, it's just a question of what, but you know, meditation, you know, just sitting there with your eyes closed, I've got 1,000 things on my to-do list, why would I want to do that? Well, it may look like you're not doing anything, but one study, for example, from Jeff Dusick at Harvard found that when you meditate, and they looked at non-meditators, people who had just been taught to meditate for 8 weeks, and more advanced meditators, and they found that same dose-response effect. You can see it goes from red to kind of green to green at the top, and on the bottom is the opposite. So meditation alone changed gene expression in several hundred genes. So it may look like you're not doing anything, but it's very powerful. We also did the first study with Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn showing that these same lifestyle changes can actually reverse aging at a cellular level. When we published this in the Lancet Oncology, the Lancet editors sent out a press release worldwide and they called it Reversing Aging at a Cellular Level. Now our telomeres are the ends of our chromosomes they're sometimes likened to the plastic tips on the ends of your shoelace that keep your shoelace from unraveling. They actually keep our DNA from unraveling. And over time, as our DNA replicates, the telomeres get shorter. And as our telomeres get shorter, our lives get shorter, and the risk of premature death from all of these chronic diseases goes up proportionate to that. We found for the first time that in just 3 months, that these same lifestyle changes could actually increase telomerase, the enzyme that repairs and lengthens telomeres, which we published in the Lancet Oncology. And over a 5-year period, we found for the first time that any intervention could actually lengthen telomeres, and again, reverse aging. We found they got about 10% longer in the group that made these changes, whereas they got shorter, which is what usually happens in the control group. And we found that the more people change, the longer their telomeres got, again, at any age. There was that same correlation. The more you change, the more you improve in every way we can measure. We also found these changes can reverse type 2 diabetes. And as you know, half of Americans today are diabetic or pre-diabetic. Half, that's crazy. Now, it turns out that we spent over $300 billion last year on the US just on treating diabetes alone. So this is a huge problem. Now, it turns out that lifestyle changes are actually better than drugs at preventing type 2 diabetes. This is from the landmark diabetes prevention program, where they found that lifestyle changes actually were better than drug and better than placebo at preventing diabetes. And lifestyle changes are actually also better than drugs at treating type 2 diabetes. Now, a lot of doctors thought, well, if we can just get tighter control of the diabetes, you know, give them enough medication, they can get their blood sugar way down, that'll help prevent the complications of diabetes. But it turned out that a review of a number of studies found that when you get your blood sugar down that low, it creates its own problems. People fall asleep when they're driving, or they pass out in their house, or they drown, or whatever. So you really, you know, or you have a double-edged sword there. But it turns out that Neil Barnard's study found that when in type 2 diabetes, your body's making even more insulin, but the receptors have downregulated. They become insulin resistant. It's like not more insulin, like the body just kind of shuts down in that way. But what Neil found was that you can become more insulin sensitive. Those receptors, in effect, wake up. And that's what we've found over 40 years, is that people who've been put on diabetes medications under their doctor's care can often reduce or even get off these medications altogether. And the complications of diabetes, any one of which would be awful, in aggregate are truly awful, heart attacks, strokes, amputations, impotence, blindness, kidney failure, and so on. But if you get your blood sugar down with diet and lifestyle, you can prevent virtually all of those complications, not necessarily if you get it down with drugs. So lifestyle changes are actually better than drugs. If you can get it down below a hemoglobin A1C, which is an average blood sugar, below 7, and that's what we found in a demonstration project we did with Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield with about 700 patients, almost 800 men and women. It was above 7 when they started. It went below 7 after 12 weeks and remained that low after a year. Now, the EPIC study that was mentioned in the last lecture showed that 93% of diabetes was prevented by making just simple lifestyle changes. Now, think about that. Half of the population today is diabetic or pre-diabetic, and yet 93% of that today is preventable. I think it's closer to 99%, maybe even 100%, if people make big enough changes. So let me talk a little bit about what we've learned that enables people to make sustainable changes, because people think that, small changes are easy and big changes are hard, and when people hear, oh gosh, there's no way my patients can make these changes. I can't even get them to eat less red meat. You expect them to be vegetarian or vegan and meditate and exercise and love more. There's no way people can do that. But what I learned is that I thought, and most of doctors are trained to try to scare people into changing. If you can just scare people enough, then they won't smoke. And, if you go through a duty-free shop in London at Heathrow Airport, they have these big pictures of people with half their faces removed on cigarette cartons or tracheotomies. Like, if we just scare people enough, make it awful enough, then they won't do that. And what I learned is that fear is not really a sustainable motivator. In the short run, it is. People will do anything after they've had a heart attack for maybe a month or two, but then they stop doing it. Because we all know we're going to die. The mortality rate is still 100%, it's 1 per person, but it's not something we think about most of the time. So fear is not really a sustainable motivator. What is sustainable is if it's fun, if you feel like you're freely choosing to do it, and we've learned that even more than being healthy, people want to feel free and in control, if it makes you feel good, and if you have a love and support. Those are the really key things. But the whole idea of even risk factor reduction is really fear-based. Put that cigarette down, you're going to get lung cancer. Put that burger down, you're going to get a heart attack. And as I said, fear is not really a sustainable motivator, not for more than a month or two. And again, even more than being healthy, people want to feel in control. And this goes back to the first dietary intervention when God said, don't eat the apple, and that didn't go so well, and that was God talking, so we're not going to do better than that. And I have an 18-year-old son, and if you tell a teenager that something's bad for them, that just makes it cool. That's why motorcycles are cool, because they're dangerous. So that doesn't work very well either. The cartoon says, I give smokers a discount because there's not as much to tell. That's the fear-based approach that doesn't work so well. These are from the drug company's own data, because a lot of doctors say, oh yeah, I can get my patients to take their Lipitor or their statins, but there's no way they're going to change their lifestyle. And yet, half to 2/3 of people prescribed statins are not taking them after just 4 to 6 months, and 25% of statin prescriptions never even get filled. And yet we're finding that we're getting 85 to 90% adherence to our program after a year, even though the program's only 9 to 12 weeks long. How can that be? Well, again, the statins don't make you feel better, but the lifestyle changes do. So, the doctor says, here, take this pill. It's not going to make you feel better. Hopefully it won't make you feel worse, to prevent something really awful from happening, like a heart attack or stroke that you don't want to think about, so people stop thinking about it. But when you make these lifestyle changes, and when people feel loved and cared for, they feel so much better so quickly, they're much more likely to make lifestyle choices that are life-enhancing than ones that are self-destructive. And, we're always making choices. It's a beautiful day today in New York. You could be doing 1,000 things, but you're here. Hopefully it's worth it, because if what you gain is more than what you give up, that makes it sustainable. And because these underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, when you make big changes, you feel so much better so quickly. It reframes the reason for making the changes from fear of dying or fear of something bad happening, which is not sustainable, to feeling good, which is. And you start to connect the dots. Like, oh, when I do this, I feel good. When I do that, I don't feel so good. So let me do more of this and less of that. And then it comes from your own experience. So then you don't have to say, which expert should I believe? You can actually experience the benefits. And to show how dynamic these are, this is from a patient who's in the California Highway Patrol who went through one of our lifestyle programs. And you can see on the left where the arrow is, there's a 50% blockage. And just 9 weeks later, it was essentially undetectable. And I spoke to the interventional cardiologist. He said it wasn't a blood clot that recanalized or a spasm. It was an actual soft plaque that regressed. It just, again, shows you, even though those plaques may take years or even decades to build up, you can show improvement in usually weeks. When you eat healthier, when you manage stress, when you exercise, when you love more, your brain gets more blood. You think more clearly. You have more energy. You need less sleep. You can actually grow so many new brain neurons in just a few weeks. Your brain can actually get bigger. I mean, imagine that. Particularly the part of your brain you want to get bigger, like the hippocampus that controls your memory. Just walking for a half hour a day for 3 months caused so much new brain growth in the hippocampus that people's brains got bigger. And some of my favorite foods, things like coffee and tea and chocolate and blueberries, actually increase neurogenesis, whereas what's bad for your heart is bad for your brain. Things like saturated fat and sugar and nicotine are actually bad for your brain as well as your heart. Whereas, believe it or not, cannabinoids, where they're legal now in California, increase neurogenesis. So you heard it first here. Your skin gets more blood, so it slows the aging process. Your sexual organs get more blood flow. This is one of the best, most effective anti-smoking billboards that was in San Francisco. And there's a wonderful new movie that's coming out that James Cameron, who did, the legendary director who did Avatar and Terminator and Titanic and all those great things, he became a vegan with his wife Susie about 10 years ago, mainly for environmental reasons, which I'll talk more about in a moment, because more global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. And so he has so much energy, he's actually making Avatars 2, 3, and 4 now at the same time. I went to the set and he's sleeping there. He's just like, he's in his mid-60s, he's got more energy than ever. So he made this film with Luis Sajoyos, who got an Academy Award for his brilliant film, his first documentary called The Cove on the dolphin slaughter in Japan a few years ago. And so they made a film called Game Changers, and Scott Stoll and I are both in that film, to try to get past the big myths that you're kind of a wimp and you don't get enough protein if you eat a plant-based diet. So he's got all these world-class athletes who lifted their game and became Olympic medalists and mixed martial artists, national champions, and heavyweight boxing champions, and NFL superstars, and so on, by eating a plant-based diet. But they have this one great scene in there that I talked about in the first chapter of my book, where they get these three guys who are elite athletes in their mid-20s. And they feed them a single meat-based meal, and it's organic beef and grass-fed beef and organic chicken or pork, just a single meal. And then at night, they had a urologist give them a device that measured how frequently they got erections at night, which is a normal human process. Guys get erections while they sleep, and how hard those erections were. And then they did the same thing the next day, and they gave them a single plant-based meal, a vegan meal, and they measured them that night as well. And they found that all three guys had 300 to 500% more frequent erections and 10 to 15% harder erections after eating the single plant-based meal than the single meat-based meal. Apparently the film crew became vegan after shooting that scene. But it really changes the whole debate. I'm going to eat a plant-based burger because it'll prevent something awful. I'll live to be 86 instead of 85. That doesn't really do it. But if you say, wow, my sexual function improves, my sexual organs get my blood flow, my brain gets more blood flow, my brain gets bigger, my skin gets more blood flow, I look younger. I'm 96, I don't think I mentioned. I think I look pretty good. Then it really changes it from doing something that may help you down the road to something that can really feel better quickly, like within a day. And then you say, again, what you gain is more than what you give up, and that makes it sustainable. We started about 6 months ago the first randomized trial to see if these same lifestyle changes can reverse early-stage Alzheimer's disease. And I have a personal interest in this because my mom, who was brilliant, died of Alzheimer's. And there are no good drugs for treating it or for preventing it. And yet these same mechanisms that cause heart disease and diabetes, again, are the same ones that cause Alzheimer's, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in your microbiome and your telomeres and angiogenesis and so on. So I think we're at a place and the studies are showing that less intensive interventions that change lifestyle can slow the rate of progression. I think it's very much like it was 42 years ago when we started doing work on heart disease. We think a more intensive intervention may actually reverse it. If a less intensive intervention can slow the progression, maybe a more intensive intervention can actually reverse it. And just to show you some of the related studies, one study showed that eating 5 or more fruits and vegetables a day was associated with a 47% decreased risk of cognitive impairment. Now, if a new drug came out could do that, it'd be a multi-billion-dollar drug. You couldn't watch a TV show without ask your doctor for this new miracle drug that can reduce the risk of dementia by 47%, but it's just fruits and vegetables. The same thing is, another study showed that in people over 65, Those who ate more fruits and vegetables had a 38% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's. People have the omega-3 fatty acids, again, a 60% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Again, imagine if a new drug came out. There are no good drugs, there are no effective drugs for treating or for preventing Alzheimer's, and yet something as simple as the omega-3 fatty acids, you can get algae-based ones, can reduce your risk by 60%. And again, what's bad for your heart is bad for your brain. More saturated fat and trans fats more than double the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. This was a study that came out about 6 weeks ago at the Cleveland Clinic. I didn't even know they were doing it, where they compared what's called TMAO levels. TMAO is a substance produced by your microbiome that has that's more strongly linked with heart disease even than cholesterol is. So this was developed by Stan Hazen and his group at the Cleveland Clinic. And they looked at TMAO levels. They found the highest levels of TMAO on the Atkins diet, medium on the Mediterranean diet, and normal on the diet that I recommend. Just one more piece of the puzzle, showing that the more markers we look at, the more diseases we study, the more scientific evidence we have to show the power of eating a plant-based diet. So what is an optimal way of eating? Well, I think it's really simple. Having debated Dr. Atkins and others over the years, which I stopped doing, well, he was the low-carb guy, so I became the low-fat guy, but it's really not low-fat. I mean, it's low-fat, but it's low-fat, it's low sugar, and it's essentially plant-based. We need to get past this whole fat versus carbs thing and talk about it in a larger picture. So what do you eat? Well, mostly plants, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes in their natural form. What we include in our diet is as important as what we exclude, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of substances in fruits and vegetables that are protective, things like phytochemicals, bioflavonoids, carotenoids, retinols, isoflavones, genistein, lycopene, on and on and on, that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, and anti-aging properties. Try to eat food as close as it comes in nature with reducing the processed stuff. Reduce total fat, and especially the so-called bad fats, the hydrogenated and saturated and trans fats. Have some of the good fats, the omega-3 fatty acids we've been talking about. Organic not only tastes better, but it has fewer of the insecticide residues, which we now know are really toxic, particularly endocrine disruptors. And eat less sugar. It's not less fat or less sugar. You want to try to reduce both. Now, when you eat a lot of sugar, it causes your blood sugar to zoom up. Your pancreas makes insulin to try to bring it back down, but over time, those repeated insulin surges downregulate the insulin receptor and cause insulin resistance, which can lead to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. But as we've talked about, good carbs, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes are rich in fiber. The fiber slows the rate of absorption, so you don't get those rapid rises in blood sugar that cause the insulin resistance. You get a more constant level that gives you a nice constant level of energy throughout the day and doesn't cause that. Well, there's still some controversies around that. Let me just go through a couple of them. One that's been repeated so often that it's almost become a meme is that, Americans have been told to eat less fat, we're eating less fat, we're fatter than ever, low fat is dead, it's all sugar. I'm sure you've heard some variation on that theme. But it turns out when I actually said, okay, well, we've been told to eat less fat, but what are we doing as a country? And when I looked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture database, which actually looks at the entire U.S. food supply every decade since 1950, not what people say they're eating, but what they're actually eating. And we found that every decade since 1950, we're eating more fat, more sugar, more calories, and more meat. So not surprisingly, we're fatter, not because we're eating too little fat, but because we're eating too much of fat and everything else for that matter. And we found in our study there was a dose-response correlation between fat intake and changes in arteries. And that was also found in the CLASS study, which was the first study using drugs to see if they could get reversal. And they found the same thing, that the more fat that people were eating, the more new blockages they had, and the worse those blockages became. And it wasn't just the so-called bad fats, it was all kinds of fats that seemed to be linked with that. This is a study from Walter Willett's group that found, again, that for every 5% reduction in saturated fat in their Harvard study, there was a 26% reduction in deaths from heart disease. But again, I think we need to get past this whole fat versus carbs debate. The animal protein itself may be even more important. And this is a study that came out from Levine, where they looked at animal protein intake, and they found that the people that ate the most animal protein had a 75% higher risk of premature death from all causes, a 400% increase in cancer risk, and a 500% increased risk of type 2 diabetes, in part mediated through what's called IGF-1, which is another substance that your body makes that causes chronic inflammation. And again, in Walter Willett's group, they found that in large numbers of men and women, animal protein intake was associated with a higher premature mortality from all causes, whereas the plant protein was actually protective. Again, not only did it not make you worse, it actually makes you better. So you get a double benefit by doing that. And they found that processed red meat was the worst, and then red meat, and then kind of going all the way down in terms of its relative risk. In another study, they found that red meat was associated with a significantly risk cause of all-cause cardiovascular and cancer mortality. And it's worth mentioning that the only diet that's actually been proven in randomized trials to reverse heart disease is the diet that we've been talking about, a whole foods, plant-based diet, low in fat, low in sugar, and so on. Whereas a low-carb diet that's high in animal protein has been found to be associated with a 30% increase higher all-cause premature death and a 51% higher risk of cardiovascular death. Now, this was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which surprised me, and they showed what happens in arteries on different diets. And on the top is a whole foods plant-based diet. The arteries are clean. The middle is a standard American diet, and you can see they're partially clogged. And the bottom is an Atkins, paleo, ketogenic, whatever the latest version of that is. And it shows that your arteries are severely clogged, even if the cholesterol and weight and so on weren't that different. It's mediated through other mechanisms that are besides just the traditional risk factors. And so you can lose weight on lots of ways, that aren't necessarily good for you. You can lose weight on an Atkins diet because most people eat too many refined carbs. And we agreed on that. It's what do you substitute for those refined carbs. And pork rinds and bacon and sausage are not health foods. But if you substitute the refined carbs, if you substitute those with good carbs, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, then it's actually, you can lose even more weight, or at least as much weight, without mortgaging your health in the process. The cartoon says that my only consolation is that by eating us, they're killing themselves. A little bit of dark humor here. Maybe early for that. Red meat consumption was associated with a 70% increased risk of lethal prostate cancer. Most guys, if you live long enough, are going to get prostate cancer. 50% of guys in their 50s, 80% of guys in their 80s have prostate cancer, but it's not going to be of clinical significance because it doesn't spread. There's something about the animal food that actually makes your cancer more likely to spread and kill you. And again, a high-fat diet increases metastasis of prostate cancer, whereas a low-fat, plant-based diet inhibits it. Plant-based diet downregulates the mTOR gene, which makes you live longer. Red meat is high in a sugar molecule that causes chronic inflammation. Again, you don't have to remember all this stuff, but the more diseases we look at, the more mechanisms in biology we look at, the more evidence we have to show why a plant-based diet is protective and a meat-based diet is harmful. Another thing that's been repeated so often, it's really become a meme, is that all calories are not alike. Carb calories, calorie for calorie, make you fatter than fat calories. Well, Kevin Hall at the National Institutes of Health put people in a metabolic ward where he could actually control exactly what they were eating. And he found, in fact, that all calories are not alike, but the opposite of what that meme is. They found that calorie for calorie, reducing fat calories causes 67% greater weight loss than reducing carb calories. Now, it's not to say that, the point is that they're both important. The people who want to reduce and say, oh, it's all sugar, fat doesn't matter, is really not the case. And fat is much denser in calories as well. It has 9 calories per gram, whereas protein and carbs have only 4. So when you eat less fat, you're eating fewer calories, even if you eat the same quantity of food, because the food is less dense in calories. And so you can eat whenever you're hungry, you can eat till you're full, and you still can lose weight and keep it off. And this just goes to show, what it feels like. 400 calories of oil barely coats the lining of your study. 400 calories of beef, maybe it's a quarter full. 400 calories of vegetables, it's completely full. So it fills you up before you get too many calories. And again, you can get all the protein you need from eating plant-based diets. I don't need to spend too much time with this group on that. What about the Mediterranean diet? Isn't that the best diet for your heart? Well, no, it's not. This study came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, made headlines around the world. They had to retract the study. They put it back in a few years later. But they said that Mediterranean diet is better than low-fat diet. Well, the low-fat diet went from 39 to 37% fat, hardly any reduction. They replaced fat with sugar, which is never a good idea. And even with all that, they actually found no difference in cardiac events. What they found was it had a massive decrease in strokes because when you eat more omega-3s, then it helps to reduce blood clotting, and blood clots account for 90% of strokes. But when they pooled the cardiac data and the stroke data, they found a reduction. But when they looked at the cardiac data alone, there was no real difference. And there are health implications that go beyond our personal health to global health. It turns out that, what I call this globalization of chronic disease is other countries are starting to eat like us and live like us and now die like us. And ironically, the diet they were eating before they started to copy ours is the one that we found that can prevent or reverse all these different diseases. And more people are dying today from what they call non-communicable diseases like heart disease and diabetes than AIDS, TB, and malaria combined in virtually every country in the world. And it's diverting a lot of resources away from things that really do require drugs to things that can be largely prevented or reversed by changing lifestyle. And what's good for you is good for the planet. What's personally sustainable is globally sustainable. From the hunger crisis, from the global warming crisis, and from the health crisis, they all intersect around food. As many of you know, it takes 14 times more resources to make a pound of meat-based protein than plant-based protein. There's enough food today. No one need go hungry if enough people were to move towards eating a plant-based diet. More livestock consumption more global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined, as we talked about earlier. And 86% of the $3.6 trillion we spent last year on healthcare, which is mostly sick care, are for treating chronic diseases that can be largely prevented or reversed by changing lifestyle. It turns out that only 5% of people account for 50 to 80% of all of these $3.6 trillion in healthcare costs. These are the people that generally have chronic diseases like heart disease. And so when we can reverse disease as opposed to simply preventing it, we can show dramatic cost savings in the first year. The first study we did with Mutual of Omaha, we found most people could choose our program as a direct alternative to having a stent or a bypass, and they found they saved almost $30,000 per patient in the first year. Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield had a matched control group. You can see on the far left the costs were the same, but after a year they were 50% lower in the group that made these lifestyle changes. And when they looked at the subgroup of people that they'd spend at least $25,000 on in the previous year, they cut their costs by 400% in the first year. And that's important because a lot of companies say, gosh, why should we spend our money for some future benefit that someone else is going to get? Because about a third of people change companies every year. But if you can show cost savings in the first year when you offer it as treatment and not simply as prevention, then those cost savings are dramatic and they become much more sustainable. And that's what we found in this demonstration project we did with Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, almost 4,000 patients. And we found beginning 12 weeks, the program was only 12 weeks long, but we followed them for a year. We see sustained weight loss, sustained reductions in angina. Most patients became angina-free in the first year. The ability to exercise went up and stayed up. The quality of life, the old joke, am I going to live longer? Is it just going to seem longer if I eat a plant-based diet? The quality of life actually improved dramatically. Systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure showed great reductions. Blood sugar comes down and stays down. Even though we were actually reducing or getting people off of their medications, those reductions would have been even more dramatic if we kept them on the same medications. Depression scores were cut essentially in half. And Medicare, after 16 years of review, created a new benefit category to cover our lifestyle program for reversing heart disease. Most of the major insurance companies are. So we're trying to create a new paradigm of healthcare where we actually spend more time with people, not just a 10-minute visit, but 72 hours. The cartoon says, like an operator, you can go on a strict diet. It says you better operate. My insurance doesn't cover a strict diet. That's been the problem. And so our approach is to have the doctor as quarterback, but he or she works with a yoga and meditation teacher, an exercise physiologist, a dietitian, a psychologist, and a nurse. And the doctor doesn't spend a lot of his or her time. They're more overseeing the other people. People come twice a week for 4 hours at a time for 72 hours. That's a very different thing than a 10-minute office visit. You have the time to do these things. They get an hour of supervised exercise, an hour of meditation and yoga. Who would have thought Medicare would be paying for that, which is really cool. An hour of a support group, an hour of a lecture with a group meal. And again, if it's reimbursable, then it's sustainable. We originally started training people in the 90s through our nonprofit institute. We trained 53 sites. Again, bigger changes in lifestyle, better clinical outcomes, bigger cost savings, better adherence than anyone had ever shown. And a number of the sites closed down because we didn't have the reimbursement. So that's why I spent 16 years to get Medicare coverage, which we're very grateful for. Because when you change reimbursement, you change medical practice and even medical education. Most of these studies are on our website. It's all free. Most of them are downloadable in PDF form. And the last thing I want to talk about in the remaining few minutes is that the real epidemic isn't just heart disease or diabetes or Alzheimer's. It's what I call loneliness and depression and isolation. And study after study have shown that people who are lonely and depressed are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely of virtually all causes when compared to those who have a sense of love, connection, and community. And to me, the deepest roots of healing, in my limited experience, are when we can transform isolation into intimacy. That, anything that brings us together is healing. Even the word healing comes from the root to make whole. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit meaning to yoke, to unite, union. These are really old ideas that we're rediscovering, that anything that brings us together is healing. Now, information is important, but we're drowning in information in the era of Google. It's not like, you tell somebody, hey, I want you to quit smoking. It's bad for you. And they go, I didn't know that. I'll quit today. Everybody knows that. It's on every pack of cigarettes. But as I mentioned, fear is not a sustainable motivator. One study showed that 6 months after a heart attack, this was done at Stanford, those that were depressed were 4 times more likely to be dead than those that weren't, independent of their cholesterol, their blood pressure, anything else like that, just from depression alone. When you're depressed, your immune function is depressed in every way we can measure. And where on the other hand, I don't know how they got this through the Human Studies Committee, they dripped rhinovirus, coal virus into people's noses. 100% of them got infected, but not everybody got sick. And the more visits from a friend and phone calls and love they had 4 times fewer infections than those that didn't have that. Men and women who are HIV positive who are depressed are more than twice as likely to develop AIDS and die from it as those who aren't. This is found in the military as well. I gave the matriculation lecture at this place called the U.S. Army War College the last few years, where they train the future generals and Joint Chiefs of Staff from all branches of the military. And when I learned that more soldiers have died by suicide than in combat, I said, you know, Houston, we've got a problem here. So I decided to talk about the power of love at the Army War College. It had a bit of a Dr. Strangelove quality to it. And I knew that if I went there as kind of the Wuss, California doc, I'd have no real street cred. So the first time I asked 4-star General Sam McChrystal if he would do a short video on the power of love. And the second time, I asked former 4-star Admiral Eric Olson, who's really a guy's guy, to talk about he was in charge of all special forces worldwide, all the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and Delta Force and Green Beret. Talks about the power of love in a way that I just find really compelling. I love that line where he says, the power of love dominates, it crushes caution and fear. That love is more powerful than fear. At Duke, they found that those, after 5 years after having an angiogram, those that were unmarried and didn't have a confidant, someone to talk with, half of those people were dead compared to only 10 to 15% of those who either were married or had a confidant. That's how powerful love and intimacy can be. We trained the St. Vincent de Paul homeless shelter in our program. Over 30,000 homeless people went through this, so it's not just for affluent people. Nicholas Christakis at Harvard did a study where we are so interconnected already that if your friends are obese, you're 45% more likely to be obese yourself. If it's your friends' friends, you're 25% more likely. And if it's your friends' friends' friends, you're 10% more likely, even if you've never met them. That's how interconnected we are. And it's not just obesity, it's depression, it's pretty much everything. Whereas David Spiegel at Stanford took women with metastatic breast cancer, gave them a support group once a week for a year, for 90 minutes, and 5 years later, those women lived twice as long. That's how powerful love and intimacy can be. And anything that creates a sense of intimacy, that brings us together, not necessarily romantic intimacy, having a dog, spending time with your friends, your family, your loved ones, leads to a sense of healing and meaning. Hostility turns out to be the most toxic emotion for our hearts and for our well-being in every way we can measure. And they did a wonderful study of almost 150 million Twitter feeds. And they found that the more hostile language they had in there, the more, especially anger, the more it predicted heart disease mortality. Now, I know that doesn't have any relevance today about, angry Twitter feeds, but I just thought I'd put that out there anyway. And, if you say I feel deprived because I can't eat everything I want, that's not really sustainable. If you say I'm choosing not to eat certain foods because what I gain is so much more than what I give up, that is sustainable. And, just the act of choosing not to eat certain foods or not to do certain things actually imbues those choices with meaning. When I was in college, I was suicidally depressed. I came very close to killing myself because I could take all the meaning out of something. Who cares? Why bother? Nothing matters. So what? Big deal, all that. But I also learned that one of the things by just choosing not to do certain things, choosing to be in a monogamous relationship, choosing not to eat certain foods, actually imbues those choices with meaning. And then if it's meaningful, it's sustainable. And I even have gotten to the point of asking people, people say, like, why do you want to change your lifestyle? Well, I want to live longer. Well, why do you want to live longer? Well, gosh, no one's ever asked me that. Doesn't everyone want to live longer? And I'll tell you, if you talk to someone who is suicide depressed or just depressed in general, and you say, do you want to live longer? They say, you don't get it. I'm just trying to get through the day. These are, and you say, why do you smoke and overeat and drink too much and work too hard? They say, because these things help us deal with my pain. I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes, they'll say. They're always there for me and nobody else is. Or food fills that void. Fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain. Alcohol, opioids numb the pain. Working all the time is a more socially acceptable way of distracting myself from my pain. Video games numb the pain and so on. So again, information is important, focusing on behavior is important, but if we work at the deeper level of why do you want to live longer, what really brings a sense of meaning? People say, well, gosh, I want to I don't know, I want to watch my kids grow up. I want to dance at their wedding. I want to, be able to make love with my partner, write a book, whatever it is that brings a sense of meaning. This goes back to Viktor Frankl's study in World War II of concentration camp survivors. The ones who survived weren't the strongest or healthiest. They were the ones who said, I need to survive so that I can, whatever, be reunited with my loved ones, or I'll bear witness or whatever. So if you can help people get in touch with that, because again, it's not just how long we live, it's how well we live that really is motivating. And meaning is really the antithesis of depression. Depression is all about helplessness and hopelessness. You take all the meaning out. And you really think you're seeing things clearly for the first time because of that reality distortion it creates. Things are bad, they'll always be bad. Anytime I thought they'd be otherwise, I was just fooling myself. And we can really help people break through that by when you choose not to do certain things, it makes those choices meaningful and even sacred in the sense of the most fun, the most meaningful, the most joyful, the most pleasurable, the most erotic, the most intimate. If it's pleasurable, it's sustainable. And it allows us to quiet down our mind and body. The ancient swamis and rabbis and priests and monks and nuns didn't develop these techniques to simply unclog their arteries, make their telomeres longer, perform better in sports or in business or in the military or whatever. It can do all those things. They're really powerful tools for transformation, for quieting down our mind and body to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and love and well-being, and to realize that's our natural state. And that may sound like a lot of semantics, but to the degree I thought when I was so depressed, I had to get into medical school so that I could then love myself and people would respect me and so on, I wouldn't feel so lonely. But once you set up that view of the world, if only I had more whatever, then I'd be happy, then I'd be healthy. Then, however it turns out, you generally don't feel either one, because until you get it, you're stressed. If someone else gets it, then you're really stressed. And even if you get it, it's great for a little bit, then it's like, well, now what? It's never enough, or so what? It doesn't really provide that lasting sense of meaning. And so the idea is that I studied for 40 years with a teacher named Swami Satchidananda, and people would say, what are you, a Hindu? He'd say, no, I'm an undu, which is where the title of my book came from. Because he said these techniques don't bring you, when you, at the end of a meditation or a yoga class or prayer or whatever you do, whether it's spiritual or secular, these techniques don't bring you a sense of peace and health. You have that already. What they do is they help to quiet down our mind enough so we can experience what's already there. And then you can go out in the world and paradoxically often accomplish more without the stress and without the illness that go along with that. And if you take the meditation deep enough, it gives you the direct experience that on one level we're separate, you're you and I, me, and we can enjoy having this conversation. On another level, we're already interconnected. We're all the same in different forms. Like the light in the movie projector that gets filtered through the film on the screen, you have all these dramas, but it's all the light behind that. And that double vision, I think, is profoundly healing. Because to me, so much of illness and stress begins by seeing people as being different and only different. Those Muslim terrorists, those Mexican rapists, is the latest iteration of that. Once you see people as being different and only different, then you can do bad things to them because they're not you. But I think all the spiritual truths, when we go from the I in illness to the we in wellness, that anything that brings us together is really healing. And these ancient spiritual truths that Aldous Huxley called these perennial philosophy, what you find in all religions and spiritual paths, once you get past the rituals that people fight and kill each other over, altruism and forgiveness and compassion and love flow naturally from the realization that we're all interconnected. That when I help you, it helps myself. When I forgive you, it doesn't condone or excuse what you did, but it frees me from the suffering of that. When I give love to you, it comes back to me. The heart pumps blood to itself first so that it can then take care of the rest of the body. These are really old ideas that we're rediscovering. It's part of what I call the conspiracy of love, that where we can help people use the experience of suffering as a doorway for transforming their lives. It allows us to reclaim our role as not just being an algorithm, but as true healers. And it helps us to use the experience of suffering as it was for me with depression. It might be for someone else a heart attack or, be on medication for whatever. To use that as a doorway or as a catalyst for really transforming our lives in ways that can help us rediscover inner sources of peace and joy and love and well-being and health and happiness, and then be able to share that with the rest of the world. So I appreciate so much the chance to share that with you today, and I hope it's been useful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean.
Here you go.
Thank you very much, Dean. So nice to have you.